hard work, if you enjoy your job, is no particular sacrifice. And I think this issue of burnout and all the rest of it, I'm probably old-fashioned in that sense. I'm not disputing it happens, but I think there's an element where it's a little bit too easy for people to hit that button and say, I've had enough. While I'm not in any way disparaging the importance of mental health and all that sort of stuff, I also think, if you want to be successful, there's an element where you've got to grit your teeth and get on with it. And sometimes it's a bit shit, and sometimes you just got to, get through it on the other end. There's no getting away from that.
Russell Clements, absolutely delighted to have you on the Purpose-Led Leadership podcast. Really pleased to have you on and sort of to find out a bit more about you as a person and your phenomenal success. Obviously, I was S3. You were one of the original first or second person at S3. So I'd love to know more about that. But let's talk a bit more about you as a person before S3. If you'd like to sort of go, as far back as school, if you can, some of the sort of journey you've been on pre-S3, it'd be lovely to hear that.
Well, thanks for inviting me on. Obviously, happy to be here. So my background, I was council estate boy, lorry driver father. My mum worked at in the Walls factory, so working class background. Went to a comprehensive. I was the first person to go to university. In fact, I was the first person in my extended family to even do A levels. It wasn't common in our family to stay on for anything longer than the absolute legal minimum required time. And actually quite a lot of my cousins didn't even get that far. And so I went to university, and actually I had a bit of a sliding doors experience when I eventually ended up doing what I ended up doing. Was that I thought I was going to be an academic. So I actually had aspirations to have a career as a lecturer. And in fact, I had a PhD lined up, decided to take a year out, and I never did the PhD. And as I always joke that, in a parallel universe, there's a Professor Clements somewhere, but not in this one. So actually, I didn't think I would end up at all where I was. Before I joined S3, I actually sold advertising space for a publishing company called VNU. And it was in that context that I originally came across Bill and Simon, who co-founded the business, originally trying to sell them advertising space. So that's how it all started, in one room in Blandford Street, opposite what is now part of the Chiltern Fire Station. So
right. Yes,
I'd love it was very scruffy back then. That part of the West End. We were there for a reason. It was cheap.
I remember seeing that old picture. I think it was you and a few others. That's the archetypal cigarette in the ashtray, kind of in the office. Brilliant old picture.
That was back in '86. Black and white pictures. Yeah.
So, I mean, I was at S3 for 5.5, 6 years, and you could cut me in half, and I'd bleed S3. I mean, how you did that, we'd all love to find out, which we'll delve into a bit more. But do you feel that your kind of upbringing and the way you described kind of like the lack of academia, do you feel that was almost a good thing though, because it kind of almost guided you towards being more kind of entrepreneurial and having to stand on your own 2 feet kind of thing?
Well, I had I always worked because there was no money, there was no spare money around. I always had jobs as a kid. In fact, I actually had my own stall on Portobello Road Market when I was 16 at the Westbourne Grove end, actually, which was the sort of the scruffy end, again, somewhere that's transformed over the years, quite glamorous these days, but it certainly wasn't at the time. So I had a bit of a kind of business orientation, a bit of an entrepreneurial mindset. But to be perfectly honest, if you'd said to me after I got to university, if you said to me at 21, here's the choice, get to do something in the commercial world or to stick to being an academic, I would have definitely chosen to be an academic. I had no idea that work was something that could be compelling and engaging and enjoyable, because pretty much that's, when you come from a sort of ordinary working class background, people do what they do largely for money and for no other reason. No one would voluntarily spend a moment longer doing most jobs than they absolutely had to. And I suppose that was the kind of condition that I had. It was a bit of a revelation to me that there were jobs around that you could actually enjoy. Obviously, do from a financial perspective as well, but where you could actually get some sort of existential satisfaction from it. So that was a real revelation for me, and it took me to be in work to really for that to dawn on me, I guess.
Yeah, so you joined Sthree in 1986. So, I mean, I'm not sure how big it actually got. It was 300, 400, 500 million, wasn't it? But I mean, in sort of a 5-10 minute statement, how did you do that?
Well, I mean, look. Well, when I left as chief executive, just to give you an idea, I mean, we had 60 offices in 20 countries, and so about 2,500 staff, and we did that all organically, as you'll know. So that was all just hiring people and developing them, rather than acquiring management experience, except in specialist areas like finance, etc. And really, we set out not with that sort of vision in mind. I mean, we didn't say for 1 minute that one day we're going to be this global publicly quoted company. I think we just had this aspiration to do as well as we possibly could do, and each time we tried to do that, what was possible got redefined. So that kind of recalibrated your ambitions, and that really set the horizons. So it would be completely fictitious to say that we sat around in a pub in 1986 and had even the foggiest idea of what the business would eventually become. We were just a bunch of very ambitious people that didn't have any real limitations on our sense of what was possible. And I guess the other thing is, where I would possibly say that there's an element of the background being relevant, is I guess we all had a bit of a chip on our shoulder as well, and something to prove, because we were a tiny little company in what was already by then a pretty competitive industry. And I joke about it, we saw ourselves as Millwall at the time, and ended up being Man United. That was how it panned out. The culture was really just a reflection of the kind of business that we wanted to work for ourselves. So we had that kind of football team type loyalty, that sense of camaraderie, the idea that your colleagues were friends as well, the fact that you wanted to behave in a way that you would have wanted to be treated yourself. So we had quite a strong ethical dimension. We had a strong sense of obligation, but that was really from the give-go, and it was the kind of people we were. It wasn't because we regarded that as being a useful bit of prerequisite for the future success of the business. We just wouldn't have run the business any other way than that.
So there's no kind of, as you said there, thank you for that. There was no kind of defined sort of plan necessarily. It was more a question of, let's not necessarily set horizons, or let's work bloody hard, but for me, it feels like, I've always said behaviors and attitude are much more important than skills and experience. Don't get me wrong, skills and experience is great, but I remember back in the day when I was there, we hired people on it was more than a gut feeling back then, and I think things have changed now. But it was kind of like, it didn't matter how many years experience you had, or if you didn't have any experience. It's more kind of what you could do, not what you've done. Would you say that was the case, or?
Yeah, except I would hope. In fact, I know that it was a lot more sophisticated than gut feeling. I mean, what we would go for, you're right in one sense, which is that we were completely open-minded about the backgrounds of people that we took on. I mean, a lot of people were graduates, but we had no hiring policy that said you had to be a graduate. What you had to be was someone that we thought had exceptional potential, and rather than that being gut feeling, we would look for evidence of that. So it didn't matter what your background was, but what you had to demonstrate to us was that you had, fundamentally, it was self-motivation. So if you were someone that can actually say, I have achieved something and I worked hard to achieve it. We weren't so concerned about what that was. It was the fact that you actually could point towards an actual tangible achievement, that you had something to back up the aspiration. So I think that was the key thing. We were looking for self-motivated people. We didn't really mind what kind of package those people came in. That was the crucial prerequisite condition. But it was self-motivation.
That's it. And obviously, when you first started, you probably had zero or very little kind of management or leadership experience. But how did you kind of deal with the growing responsibility of be in the position as you were? Was it kind of like just as you went along, you learn, or what?
Yeah. I mean, that was what was exciting about it. We were kind of busking, it was like, we're floating a company, none of us had done that before, it's 100% conscious of the fact that you were doing things you'd never done before, but that was the excitement of it. I mean, the one thing I would say is people talk a lot about imposter syndrome, and I don't think we ever suffered from that. Right. I don't think we ever felt like, we didn't deserve this. That somehow we were going to be caught out, that people that perhaps had different kind of backgrounds to us were better than us. When I was interacting with investment bankers, I knew very well that they took my accent and extrapolated assumptions around that. But I actually knew deep down that I was probably brighter than them, so it didn't really bother me how they felt about me. So I think we had a lot of self-confidence, a lot of balls. I think in the sort of old-fashioned sense of it, and that gave us the belief that just because we hadn't done something before didn't mean to say we couldn't do it now.
I think that's right. When the kind of shackles are off and you haven't got the straitjacket and you haven't got anyone, there's no conformity. I think one of the reasons. I mean, I was the group's top biller. A lot of people know that for a number of years, and I think one of the reasons why I was successful was the framework and the environment that you created, but also when I was making cold calls, I didn't treat anyone as inferior or superior. So kind of for me, everyone was a level playing field, and I think speaking to a CEO or speaking to a Java developer, it didn't matter. I had the same kind of level of kind of like, actually, I'm not better than you, but I'm certainly not inferior than you. And I think that carried me through. And I think the way that you did that, you kind of engendered that in your people. I mean, I think we can't dismiss that. I know you've kind of been quite laissez-faire about it, but I think it's an art to be able to create people to have that belief as well, because people have belief, but you still got to push them and I mean, talk to me about how you or the team kind of created that belief as well.
Well, you hire people that are a bit like that to begin with, I think, and that's the point. If you had someone that was overly deferential in an interview, someone that was a little bit too overawed by the fact that they were meeting someone that was senior to them in the first place, that would obviously potentially set the alarm bells ringing. I mean, I think there was a fine line between wanting a degree of confidence that people came with to begin with, and this is probably where it was tricky, and why we actually ended up, I don't know, interviewing 12 or 14 people for every job. Was the fact that we basically needed, on the one hand, someone who was confident, almost to the borderline of cocky. On the other hand, we wanted people that absolutely were sponges when it came to learning how to do things the way we wanted them to do it. And that's probably the paradox, was actually having people that had that level of confidence, but they had the humility to want to work and learn in an environment where it was very much, we do it this way. And you've really got to get into that and absorb that and embrace it. So getting those two potentially quite contradictory characteristics in the same people was obviously quite a challenge.
No, absolutely. I mean, this isn't an exaggeration. There are thousands of people like me who worked at Sthree and then gone on to be very successful business owners. And for me, when I built my business, that was a proud moment for me. But one of the more proud moments was the people that worked for me then left and went on and did the same as what I did. They built their own businesses as well. So talk to me about, I'm sure Sthree is one of the most proudest moments, but intrinsically kind of the fulfillment piece around what you got from that whole experience. Just talk to us about that a bit more.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that, you want to keep people, you want to keep entrepreneurial people. You don't want them necessarily to go off and set up businesses in competition. So, you could argue every time that happened, by some degree, that was a failure, because it would have been better for us as a business if people were had stuck around. Now, that's, especially in a market like recruitment where the barriers to entry are so low, that's an unrealistic aspiration anyway. And I suppose the good thing was that we hired people of that caliber, that they could go on and do their own thing and be successful at it. I think, if you look back at what you're most proud of, I think part of it was taking people from backgrounds that frankly wouldn't have got a look in from a lot of other companies and a lot of other organizations, and seeing those people develop and become more confident and become successful, seeing the level of pride that they got in their own achievements, hearing about how proud their parents were of them, and all that sort of stuff. You get a big kick out of that. There's a point which, money's great and it's a good way of keeping score, as someone famously said, but inherently you need something more than that over the longer term, and certainly seeing other people develop and feeling that you had a part to play in that is one of the key reasons why you do the job.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I always worked hard from a very young age, but S3 made me work even harder, but in a good way. But then one of the latest sort of buzzwords or recent buzzwords is burnout, and people have got different views on this. And I feel that if I didn't work as hard as I worked, there's no way I would have achieved what I've achieved. But there's a limit, right? But so with yourself personally, I know S3 advocate hard work, but in a good way because the rewards are there. How have you kind of looked after yourself in terms of well-being, mental health, time management, your family? Because it's not all about S3, is it?
Well, it was for me for a long time, and I think that's the truth of it. I mean, if I think back to, I retired early. I was 48 when I retired, which is a nice position to be in. Oh. But I remember the first time I was ever really at home when my kids got home from school. Was actually after I retired, and I can remember that I've got twins and a daughter that were very close in age, so they were all in sixth form together, and they came back from sixth form at the local school, and I remember sitting there, and I'd been at home the whole day, and there they were back from school, and I thought, they're 16 and 18, and it's taken that long before I've really been in that position. So there were sacrifices to make. There were sacrifices I was conscious that I was making at the time. I mean, it wasn't like I woke up one day and thought I could have seen more of my kids. I knew that there were other jobs, there were other things I could have been doing if that was the number one priority. And you actually ultimately, in life, you make decisions. Whether the right decisions, whether, if someone's turned around and said, I think you've got that completely wrong, you've got your priorities completely arse about face, I completely respect that person's position. It's a completely legitimate position for them to take. It just isn't how I did it. We had a hardworking culture, as you said. I think for me, it was always incredibly important that we as leaders in the business walk the walk. Right up to the point at which I didn't work or didn't work full time. If you phoned up at 8 o'clock in the morning, I would answer my phone. I'd be at my desk by 8 in the morning. It's unlikely I'd be out of my desk by 7 o'clock in the evening if I was not traveling thousands of miles a year. So that hard work, if you enjoy your job, is no particular sacrifice, and I think this issue of burnout and all the rest of it, I'm probably old-fashioned in that sense. I'm not disputing it happens, but I think there's an element where it's a little bit too easy for people to hit that button and say, I've had enough. And while I'm not in any way disparaging the importance of mental health and all that sort of stuff, I also think, if you want to be successful, there's an element where you've got to grit your teeth and get on with it. And sometimes it's a bit shit, and sometimes you just got to, get through it on the other end. There's no getting away from that.
Right, and that's what makes you stronger and all that kind of stuff. But I feel that S3 rode a wave, and I feel that the principles, the way that you pushed to people was great, and it kind of worked back then in the 80s, 90s, noughties. But do you feel that approach would work now? And how do you feel about that whole kind of thing now, where it's like, working from anywhere, and the burnout and the well-being? Do you think it's over to you?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I absolutely think that there is genuine differences between generations, right? Yeah. And actually, interestingly enough, the last management conference that I sort of hosted as chief executive, the theme from that was the acknowledgement of the fact that we had management and the staff were from different generations. Yeah. And for me, it was as profound a difference as if you had people that were from different cultures, or from different or from genders, or any other kind of way in which you think about, people think differently because they're a woman, or they think differently because they're German rather than British, or Japanese or whatever it might be. I mean, that generational thing is a very profound difference. And I think you're naive if you think it's not real.
Oh, absolutely.
So it does throw up, I think, massive challenges. And I think businesses that are, if you like, trying to adopt a kind of old school mentality, and impose that on that generation, it's hard. It really is hard. There's no question about it. I would say my caveat to that would be if you then throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, well, you've then got to do what they want you to do. You've got to run run your business, as if it was actually being run by a millennial or a Gen Zer or whatever. Then frankly, you'd have a very nice business with lots of, thoughtfulness and mindfulness, I should say, and well-being issues, and you probably go out of business after 5 minutes. So for me, it is, as all things are, about striking a balance. But I'm absolutely 100% cognizant of the fact it's a very real problem. Or very real challenge.
There's this whole compassion, vulnerability, kind of well-being, mental health thing. I think it's great. But you're right, it's a complete dichotomy to what it was like, when we were doing it, or certainly when you were doing it as well. But do you feel that this generation has more to offer than the previous generation? And in what way? And what are the advantages and disadvantages, would you say?
Look, I speak as a father of 3 20-something-year-olds. I think the mentality of people is different. I think that you're in some respects they're more sophisticated than my generation was. I think they're more demanding of work. They want more out of work, and it's more multidimensional. I do think there's an element of I want it all, I want it now, I just don't want to work very hard for it. So I would say, this is a massive generalization. I'm not sure that the most recent generation, in my experience, have the same work ethic that perhaps, I'm probably borderline. In fact, I think I am borderline baby boomer, actually. So I think there are, that just that sheer kind of, stamina, the horsepower behind the winning list to just, get on with it and put the hours in. I don't think that's perhaps there in quite the same sort of way.
I agree. I think, you're Ned. I'm a Ned as well. And obviously the pandemic has affected business in many different ways, but I think there is a hangover from that. And what I'm finding is that there's a bit of a kind of like, but the impact of COVID, the impact of the pandemic. But I feel with that as almost like the whole work from home, working from anywhere thing. I now believe that the hybrid model is a good way forward, where if you asked me 4 years ago about working from home or anywhere, I would have said absolutely no way. But I feel that you're right. I think sometimes the only way to kind of is to fight fire is to get on with the bloody job, right? So what's your view on this kind of the flexible working from home and all this kind of stuff around, for me, the office environment? You just can't beat that for culture.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that I don't think you can generalize about the world of work, right? I mean, if you're an IT person, right, and you can do your job just as well, not coming into the office, and you don't particularly miss the experience of going into the office, and the office doesn't particularly miss you being there, then why the hell are you, dragging your sorry ass on a train an hour each way? So I think for certain types of role, then working from home makes absolute, 100% sense. I think any kind of learning environment, any environment where you're trying to pick up stuff through osmosis, and whether that's a working environment or an educational environment, then I absolutely believe that there is no substitute for human interaction. And the issue for me is the fact that, the comparison with schools is probably quite an obvious one. If you regard the fact that kids learn better and learn in the broader sense better as a result of physically being in school, then there's a natural quid pro quo for that, which is the teachers have got to be in school, right? So if you're talking about a typical kind of sales environment and everyone agrees, of course, the rookies have to be in the office. Well, yeah, but also that means by by implication, the managers have got to be there, because that's who the rookies are going to be learning from, in the same way that the teachers have got to be there if the kids are learning. So, I mean, if I ruled the world, I would have everyone in the office for the absolute maximum amount of time that they possibly can be there before it gets dysfunctional and in the office for the sake of being in the office. Certainly, if I was a 20-something-year-old, I'd want to be in the office.
Oh,
the idea of actually just fighting for space around a kitchen table in Balham, with my 4 roommates or flatmates or whatever, that doesn't appeal to me at all.
In terms of the age group, I do feel sorry. I felt sorry for like the 16 to 22-year-old in the pandemic. I mean, what a time to have a pandemic at that age. That must have been terrible, but it's terrible for everybody. But in terms of this kind of meteoric rise, from 2 or 3 people to 60 offices and 300 or 400 million quid, and I'm sure there were some difficult times and some dark times. So give us 1 or 2 examples where you were in the shit, or you was in the trenches. You had some real sort of issues, and how did you deal with those?
Well, I mean, I think as someone who made their career in sales, everyone has their dark moments. I mean, anyone that's actually a recruitment consultant will relate to this. I had 3 dropouts in 3 phone calls on a Friday afternoon,
right.
Literally one after the other. And as I always tell people now that, and I genuinely believe it, it's the bad experiences that are the most valuable from the perspective of learning and getting better for the future. But, the idea that I was, by that 3rd phone call, saying, this is a wonderful learning experience, I'm so glad I had it, I wasn't going down, I didn't go down the pub that Friday and get,
thoroughly,
on the basis of celebrating the learning experience. I was there to drown my sorrows, right? So that happens all the time. That one particular Friday is my Black Friday, if you like, but there were lots of variations on that. And that's the difference, right? In sales, particularly, you are well paid in sales because you can cope with those knockbacks and come back from them. And that is not something that most people can do. Otherwise, it wouldn't be hard to hire salespeople, keep them, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of inherent bounce back ability, that kind of robustness of personality or whatever, unless you've got that, then it's going to chew you up and spit you out years before. Running the movie forward, I mean, being in a public company, being in a position where you've got an external marketplace interested in everything you do, and particularly your results, and having situations where you find out things that aren't looking great from the perspective of does that look like we're going to hit this quarter's numbers, or are we going to hit this year's numbers, and all the rest of it? That's pretty stressful. That's something that you've got to be able to cope with. So there've been plenty of times, where I've actually thought, why the hell am I doing this? But that's if you can give me describe to me one single job there is in that everyone sort of dances into work every time, every day, and loves it. I'm sure like a lot of people, my ideal job probably would be to be a professional footballer, but I can't imagine that.
You and me both, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Every professional footballer walks around on a little kind of cushion of air the whole time,
Yeah, of course.
So you just get on with it. I mean, going right the way back to my childhood, I was a clever kid in a crap school. And was bullied as a consequence of it. That certainly had something to do with my making my personality what it was having that mentality that I'm clever, you're stupid. In the end, I'll have the last laugh.
Right. So that kind of gave you. So that's the thing. Let's talk about. I mean, the bullying thing, but to talk about kind of like 3 boys. So you're a father as well, and I think often people don't realise. No,
I've got a daughter. I've got a daughter.
A daughter. Sorry.
You talk about my kids, yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of any adversity kind of away from the business, because like you being a father and a family man and a husband, all that kind of stuff, that's a job in itself, right? I mean, you must have had some difficult times, like kind of managing all that as well.
Yeah. I think having kids is the biggest responsibility that you'll ever have. I
Mm.
think one of the things, if you're a professional manager, the biggest thing you've got to be conscious of is don't manage your kids,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And actually, there's a temptation to do that. Interestingly enough, I sent my kids to the local comprehensive, albeit in a nice area. And the one thing about private school is that they beast your kids for you, right? I mean, let's be absolutely clear. That's part of the reason why you're charged what you're charged. It's the equivalent of going to a trainer in a gym, right? You know, that you're paying to be beasted. Even good comprehensives don't have that. So you've got to do the beasting. You know, if you've got, if you want to drive your kids a little bit, and there's a fine line with that, you know, between being the encouragement, you know, that you could do better, you know, and all the rest of it, and actually being, you know, the pain in the arse father. You know, that's a balance that's very hard to get right. I certainly didn't always get it right.
I found that difficult, you know, being a CEO, you know, and trying to not bring my work approach to the fatherhood. You know, kind of like you can't sort of telling your son to make more phone calls at home isn't, you know, it's not going to go down too well sometimes, is it? I think it's a difficult one when you're putting all your kind of time and effort into the work. Sometimes to kind of decompress and kind of without being too kind of like new age, but the mindfulness of that. I mean, were there any challenges around kind of like not being connected to your family or son, or did that not really happen for you?
No, I never had a great deal of difficulty switching off from work, right? So I wasn't someone that, you know, came home and had sleepless nights. I mean, there were the odd sleepless nights, don't get me wrong, but I never really had that kind of sense. I did a spell at business school in the States. And that was very interesting because the first thing they said to us pretty much was go back to your room and delete your inbox, right? So that you can actually, you know, properly benefit from this course. And a lot of the Europeans, and I include the Brits in that, went, yeah, what a great idea, let's do it, right? And the Americans were absolutely aghast at the idea of it. Yeah. And not only that, you know, you'd be in the classroom or in the lecture sort of scenario, and they'd be on their laptops, you know, they'd be you know, so their company paid for them to supposedly have this learning experience, but still expected them to be so engaged with the day-to-day work that they just half the mind was on that and half the mind, you know, and I was just like, what's the point, right? So I had no difficulty parking that in that.
That's great. That's a great leadership trait to have, actually.
Well, I just you know, it's only so important, right? I mean, work is only so important. It's important, but it's not, you know, it's not life or death.
So great. We're coming towards the kind of the last third of the podcast, last quarter of the podcast now. We want to kind of move on to kind of post Sthree. So talk to me about that kind of transaction. What happened, your exit, and, you know, how did you then, or how have you pivoted? Because you've got a few investments going on as well, haven't you, at the moment? Is that right?
Yeah. So I mean, I knew when I left Sthree, I didn't want to do another big job. In that sense, I didn't particularly want to join the board of a public company that I didn't care about. And if I looked back at the two times that I found my career most interesting at Sthree, it was when we were a very small company and when we were a bigger company.
Okay.
And so actually, what I've done really since then is I've actually got more involved with smaller businesses, either as an NED or an investor or both. Because actually the one thing I realized I didn't get much of towards the end of my career at Sthree was that kind of more mentoring type role, you know, to really have a kind of one-on-one relationship with someone and really see that development that we talked about earlier on. And so being involved in smaller businesses has allowed me to scratch that itch again. So that's been really good, and I've stuck pretty much with what I know. Most of what I've been involved with is in the staffing business, or it's tech for staffing. So from that perspective, I've been an angel investor. I've been a board consultant. I've done various different roles. But it's interesting that I thought when I left Sthree after 26 years, it would be like someone leaving the army and find it really hard to adjust. You know?
Yeah.
And actually, it was nowhere near as difficult as I thought it would be. The thing that is quite hard early on is the idea of having a few things that you're supposed to be interested in, as opposed to this monomania with one particular big job. You know, so being able to, right, oh, this week I am this person, not this person, but this is my responsibility and priority this week. That was actually quite an adjustment. But I was less institutionalized than I thought I perhaps would have been.
I was literally going to say, how did you do that for 26 years? But I guess that's the kind of like an open mind. It feels like you were, although we were talking about learning on the job, it felt like you were guiding others, but you probably learned from a lot of great people. And I think a good leader is also only as good as the people around him, right? Would you say that's true?
Yeah. No, well, look, we had a board with non-execs. You know, my old chairman, Sir Anthony Cleaver, was the ultimate kind of, captain of industry type, and I learned, loads from him and from the other NEDs. I mean, we did a venture capital deal before we did the IPO. So in '99, we took a chunk of money out from Barclays and having the VCs on board, which was 6 years before we actually floated the business. That was a real learning experience as well. So yeah, look, I mean, I think that was why I stuck it for as long as I did, was the fact that there was a kind of intellectual fascination about how far we could take the business, and the business changed all the time, So, as we got into new markets, as we internationalized the business, from each year, it was a different company. So, when I say I've been with the same company for 26 years, that's nonsense really, because the company I left and the company I joined was unrecognizable.
Certainly. Yeah, no, I agree with that. So, I mean, this podcast is called the Purpose-Led Leadership Podcast, and I'm all about purpose. Now, what would you say your purpose is, if you have thought about it, and how has it changed, and how will it change, do you think?
Well, I think for me, the purpose was I'm a very competitive person, right? Okay, as anyone that's ever been in a pub quiz with me, will make sure the answer is 100%, qualified. Otherwise, I'd be on your case. I'm extremely competitive. For me, the outcomes, the hitting the targets, the hitting the business targets, watching the share price rise, all of that was inherently very satisfying for me, right? Yeah. Maybe old-fashioned, it may be a bit kind of like, superficial, but actually I got a lot out of that. So running a successful business, for all the conventional reasons that you run a business, I got a lot of inherent, satisfaction out of doing that, doing the competition, being better. None of that was bad. But if there was a purpose beyond that, I circle back around to what I said before, which was this idea of seeing other people develop, right, and seeing other people transform their own circumstances. And the amount of times I've actually had people say, joining this company was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. I wouldn't be the person that I am. My circumstances wouldn't be what that, that happened all the time. And insofar as we had a higher purpose as a business, that was the higher purpose, was really to see that the people that we took on develop and become, the best people that they could be in that world. So that sounds cheesy, but it happens to be true.
Doesn't. I mean, I can testify that, because I'm one of them. I mean, I'm eternally grateful for you and the other people at Sthree. There's so many to mention, isn't there? I mean, exactly. proper legends.
Not to mention all the Sthree marriages, the Sthree children.
Yes.
I mean, that would be an interesting one. I wonder how many kids are actually around that are a consequence of their parents meeting at Sthree. It must be in the hundreds.
You've got your own tribe, mate. You're doing really well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's actually a few more years, and we'll probably have the first Sthree grandchildren.
So, in terms of any business owners out there that would want to hear you give them one or two pieces of advice around, if someone's setting up now or just started, what sort of tips can you give recruitment business owners now to sort of grow, scale, and do it in the right way?
Well, look, I mean, you could recruitment is a simple business, right? Okay, if you actually modeled it, it's a pretty simple business. If you wanted to really focus on one thing above all else, 80% of success in that market is hiring great people and keeping them. Right. Everything else apart from that is largely details, but saying it and doing it are two fundamentally different things. Okay. But essentially, if you can just work on the basis that if you're getting that right, if you're hiring the best people or the best people available to you, you're inspiring them and motivating them, giving them the circumstances that give them the confidence that they want to stay, then really the majority of the rest of the prerequisites of leadership are, if not poor seconds, they're all ancillary and secondary to that.
I agree with you, and I think you're right. It's half the battle is getting them, but then you've got to keep them, retain them, and grow them, right?
Yeah, and actually, there's a circular thing there. You hire the right people in the first place; they're more likely to stay, right?
Yeah,
so
that's very true.
Retention, and the other thing is taking personal responsibility for it. The amount of times I've had people say, "Well, yeah, we lost so and so and so and so, but they were rubbish anyway." Well, hang on a minute. Did the government make you take them on? Was there some sort of? Did someone have a gun at your head when you actually hired them?
Exactly.
You hired them. You're responsible for them. So, and that's another. I suppose that's the other thing about it. That taking personal responsibility for the outcomes of the people that you actually employ.
So true. So a couple of last questions, really. 2 in 1 question. What kind of gets you up in the morning these days, considering you've done pretty much most things, and what keeps you up at night?
Very little keeps me up at night, actually. And very little ever did. I've never struggled to really turn off in that way. I mean, these days, obviously, I'm not completely retired from that perspective, so I'm still engaged with certain parts, certain businesses, etc. Other than that, you do all the stuff that when you're working full time, you wish you had the time to do. Travel, all of the stuff that people say. There's a thing which says the people that are in positions to take early retirement are probably the people that are least interested in taking early retirement, right? So there's a paradox there, but it's quite easy to be busy doing not very much, as I found.
No, very true. So in the advent of, well, not the advent, the hot topic of mental health and wellbeing, but more kind of looking after yourself. So, you're very energetic, vibrant, positive. Well, you're certainly given that impression. I've spoken to you a few times. Either you're a good actor or it's real. How do you look after yourself mentally and physically?
Well, look, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm super active, but I'm active in the sense of, I keep fit. I cycle a lot, all of that sort of stuff. I think that is a very important thing for what it's worth. The whole time I worked, I would always make sure that, there was time to be in the gym or whatever. I think that's that kind of physical unwind. I don't think you can. I was never a brilliant athlete or anything like that, but I always played football or whatever it might be, going right the way through my life. And I think that's a really important thing. And I actually think, look, it's very simplistic, but just relaxing and doing not very much. I mean, I think before we started this recording, you were talking about, going to the pub and having a few pints, having a nice Sunday lunch, right? Okay. Just the sort of simple pleasures of life. Never lose sight of the fact it doesn't have to be a Michelin star restaurant. It can be a pub lunch. It can be just as enjoyable.
That's true. And final question, you might have already answered it, but if there's one thing you'd like the audience to be left with from you, what would it be?
Probably this, that I think there's a lot of cynicism about business, and I think there's a lot of there's a view which is that the most successful businesses kind of use people up and wear them out. And actually, I'd say that it's the opposite. I think the most successful businesses, certainly in the space that I've had experience of in the last 30 odd years, the most successful businesses are the ones that care about their staff. So, nice guys don't finish last, I suppose, is the thing I'd probably leave as a thought. You can be a decent person and be successful in all the normal kind of measurable ways. The two aren't mutually incompatible.
Love that, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Learned a lot from you. I'm sure others have as well. Where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
Well, I'm not the biggest user of LinkedIn, but anyone's desperate to find me, as you did, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Brilliant, mate. Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. Thanks.